Hey Ilse,
Hi, Marcus.
how are you?
Good, thank you. And you?
I'm good. I'm very hot. I'm back in the Dezeen office because it's too noisy to work at home at the moment, and it's absolutely baking here. I recognise where you are though.
Yeah, my bedroom. So you shouldn't recognize it that much.
No, you have
But you will recognize it in some
your
way.
house, the bits of your house that I've actually been to.
Yeah, I know there are some columns that you will recognize, but what you will also hopefully recognize is my most precious possession in the material world, which is a large piece of bark cloth, which was made by the Bureau Berlin, who were former students. And it's just fantastic. You know, it's an old thing that's a new thing, you know, the older than textile, but, you know, probably the most beautiful new thing I can think of.
Is that the thing hanging in the background?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
So what is it? It's cloth made of bark.
Yeah, so it's an old technique. It was actually Lenica's graduation project at the Design Academy, Eindhoven. So basically, you know, older than textile is hammered bark. And this was a project she did in Tonga. And then with a sort of sleight of hand, it is then, how do you say, it's sort of machine stitched with a kind of cross stitch to basically hold it together forever, sort of thing. So it's this sort of modern jacquard, if you like, on a really ancient piece of bark. It's a fantastically beautiful thing.
So anyway, Ilse, welcome to today's live interview. It's part of our collaboration with Braun. Earlier on, we were talking to Benjamin, Peter from Braun about the theme, which is good design in times of change. But why are you here today as part of this Braun collaboration? What's the connection?
I have very recently, so it is brand new, so too early to describe in detail, but been asked to work with Braun and the Braun team to develop a series of masterclasses based on the Braun principles, the Dieter Braun principles, you know, such as built to last, simple, etc., but to really explore those for a young design interested audience and see their relevance really for today as a way of thinking rather than an aesthetic. I mean, rather, as Peter was saying, you know, it's not about looking at things stylistically, it's about looking at the principles that go behind the thing that lead to a certain response to the world.
And that's literally something that's just been established in the last few days, is it, that those master
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, we're working on it sort of as of now. But I think it's a really interesting topic because I think, I mean, certainly one of the things that you probably know only too well is that I think my view is that design is too often treated as a noun and not a verb. You know, it is a process of going from realities, of ideas, of needs. It's joining many, many dots and then synthesizing those into new realities that make sense. And it's an extraordinary discipline, I think, because it's one of the few that can go from the philosophical to the tangible. And, you know, whether we are aware of it or not, actually, you know, at times like this, design is a hugely important tool for having agency over the world that will happen as part of teams, not on our own. I mean, we have to be careful of overstating our case, but I think as part of teams, I think we're really valuable because we can help, I think, be a bridge between ideas and reality, make values visible, if you like.
And this is the first time you've worked with a sort of a hardware company, a technology-driven company like Braun. I know you've done some lighting collaborations, but you're best known, of course, for your interior work and the kind of the mood that you create and the craftsmanship and the whole well-being approach. So where does your subset of design overlap the Braun subset of design, would you say?
I think that it depends on what your definition of technology is, doesn't it? I mean, if you talk about technology being a bridge to the future, you know, whatever medium that might be, then I think the thought process is, you know, obviously with different contexts are not dissimilar. Because I mean, in some ways, what I do as an interior designer is, you could argue, quite technical, because you're looking at I mean, if you're, let's say, looking at a hotel or even an airport lounge, you're looking at the, you know, the practical needs, the operational needs, the needs throughout the day, the needs throughout the year. You're mashing all of these things together, and very often technology plays an important part in that. I mean, certainly does in the context of an airport lounge. And how do you integrate those into physical space? So it's that mass of information that you have to make sense of and synthesize, and then find the most simple, intuitive response, which I think is in a way a very similar process, but obviously the context of skill sets are different, but I think the approach is not entirely different.
Are you hearing some pinging? I think that might be me. Did you
I
hear
think it might be me, actually. Hold on.
your email up? I'm using a different computer to normal, but
I think it's all my technology, which is
your email's open. Sounds like an Apple Mail notification.
yes, there'll be a lot of those. So let's try and turn it off. Okay. Sorry about that, guys.
It's not the end of the world. I just thought it was me, because when I get text from my son, it gets ping on the screen, but that was a different sound that time. Let's not worry about it too much.
Okay, I'm going to do this. Let's do. Yeah, hold on. Kind of find my. Oh yeah, got it. Play sound off. Hooray. May have worked. Let's hope.
Okay. Anyway, back to the conversation. You've got a little presentation of your work. Why don't you fire that up now and we can go through that and then talk about design in the times of change afterwards.
You have to invite me, or you may have done already.
No, it should still be set up from before.
Okay, let's
screen, share your screen, share screen. There we are.
Fantastic. It works. Presentation. Well, I think it's more of a discussion, really. I've just got 3 projects that I could show and share quickly. I think what's interesting about interior design is it's so often seen as, you know, choosing chairs or, you know, an aesthetic, essentially. You know, as I said earlier, nice to have, but not need to have. It's sort of confused with soft furnishings in some people's minds. So I think what's quite interesting about our approach, by, you know, focusing on the human experience, focusing on real needs, and my big caveat there is it's needs, not wants. That I think is how you can make interiors that really in the end are sort of an embodiment of the life that will be lived in a place, and that consequently, one would hope, are loved, but certainly are livable and have a greater chance of lasting. This was a former soup kitchen, now community kitchen. Again, so often people think that interior design is really just for a sort of fancy side of life. And we certainly do have some clients who have some fairly fancy places, but we also are very committed to using our skill sets across sectors, and, you know, also for clients who maybe wouldn't normally have access to that skill set. So this is Refectorio Felix in Oscourt, part of the Food for Soul project, chaired by Massimo Bottura and his wife. And it's an extraordinary project which basically integrated design with an attitude to food, but fundamentally an attitude to people. The idea that the brief was to bring dignity around the table, primarily, to bring beauty into a social sector that is not, generally speaking, you know, discussed in that way. You know, that actually it's really about creating a frame for people to come together. Now, the budget was, you know, tiny, but with a brief like that, we were able to get people to donate, to repurpose furniture that, for example, may have been used in fairs or in showrooms or whatever, you know, Vitra, Artemidi, Alessi, all sorts of people joined in on this project, you know, also Sheridan Coakley, LaRusi. I mean, you know, who wouldn't want a brief like that? And, you know, in the end, that was what we were able to do. And, you know, the building was already had great bones. There was, you know, it was the art of the possible. But what was so fantastic about it was that a place that had been in and out, you know, basically people had come and got food, it was transactional, it was decent, it was incredibly valuable in its former iteration, but now it's a place where people hang out, or at least now, but shortly again, I hope, together. Now, you know, obviously they won't be able to be in quite such close proximity, but I think what's great about it is that it is a hub, it's a center, it's a home for people who, you know, are generally speaking homeless. I mean, they stay in hostels, but this is where they hang out during the day. Those values, though, for me, are a constant across all our projects. I mean, you know, this, as I said, was, you know, low budget, high priority, in my opinion. And they've done several others, Food for Soul have done several others based on that principle, that shared model. That's also what's great about it, is it's not about owning it, it's about a model that works. Completely different sector, completely different application is Ethem, which is probably the hospitality project that we are best known for. It's in Stockholm. It's a small hotel. It was a student information center. Sometimes when people go there, they think that it's been like that forever, you know, how lucky we were to find such a lovely building to furnish. No, it wasn't. You know, a lot of what we do is actually going right back to the origins of a building to understand the layout, but not only that, just how it was lived in, what made it tick, what was its character. I think understanding the nature of a building allows you then to build on it. So for example, here we really wanted to make something that in some way challenged the whole idea of what a hotel was. You know, we like Jane Jacobs, the late great Jane Jacobs' observation that new ideas need old buildings and old ideas sometimes need new buildings. And this is definitely a case of the former. Because of the tight footprint, it's, you know, didn't allow you on the ground floor to have the usual sort of back and front of house. There isn't one. So you are thrown right into the middle of the workings of the machine. The staff in many ways are your hosts and you are in their world. And that's the joy of it. It also creates this great relationship, I think, between the people that work there, the professionals that run it day to day, and the people who visit. It's a completely different connection to the usual sort of, if you like, more servile take on service. And the staff there really own it. You know, you feel like it's their project, which was always a part of the idea. This is how it is now. And, you know, although it's compact, it's flexible, it's adaptable. It has identity in the sense that it is building on the arts and crafts idea of the building, which was built in 1913. And in many ways, we've translated that sort of idea of, you know, domesticity as a model for hospitality today, an updated model. Technology is there, it's embedded. You have the, you know, the best technological support is just not visible, but it's embedded. And it's been there now for, you know, nearly 10 years and has now grown into the building next door. So I think it's sort of brand expression, I think, through its physicality is allowing it to grow organically. And then lastly, something really lovely. One might say, you might say, okay, that's fine if you're dealing with small projects, you know, and you have reasonable budgets, but what about, you know, can you scale it up? And I would argue that you can. This is one of the Cathay Pacific lounges in Hong Kong that we addressed. We worked with Cathay Pacific and developed a global model, I would say, for their lounges. I mean, they've now built 10, and they needed to be able to deal with up to 2,000 people a day. So we're not talking about little bijou corners of an airport, you know, they're almost public space. I mean, they're heavily trafficked. It'll be interesting to see what happens now, but certainly at the point where they were built, you know, thousands of people going through every day. I mean, it's a hub of the international traveler. And I think moving it on from, if you like, the idea, the very old-fashioned idea, I think, of luxury to being something that really was genuinely hospitable to the people that were using it, that addressed their well-being. I mean, you know, we had stacks of data, but in the end, I think the most useful thing was actually just to sit in the lounges and talk to people, you know, to listen, to watch, to ask questions and understand how they were feeling. I mean, they looked knackered. You know, understanding what that meant in the context of their lives in terms of how that could then be reimagined in terms of a place that could support their daily working lives was really interesting, and how you could bring well-being into that. We looked at how to create warmer, more comfortable environments, but in the end, it was about layering of details so that they were properly supportive. So from lighting to being able to use technology and charge easily without crawling on the floor. I mean, blindingly obvious, but not, I think, often done in practice. The material qualities, so using wood because you otherwise bash your suitcases into paint, which is never maintained enough because airport lounges don't close for very many hours. Very durable floor. Actually, we chose a retail floor. It's not a very fancy floor, but it's super durable. Dimensions of chairs so that you actually sit you sit horizontally, so to speak, not vertically. So you're not front to back, you're side to side, because actually today with laptops, with iPads, people tend to sit diagonally. A whole layering of detail. One of the very interesting things that we discovered, for example, was the amount of food waste that typically goes with these spaces. So we looked again through the numbers, we talked to people and realized that it was actually cheaper to train some of the people who were behind the wall making food for the rather overloaded buffets that were then, you know, such terrible culprits of waste, not to mention the heat lamp factor. And we also understood from talking to people that what they really wanted was healthy, fresh food. I mean, ideally soups, because, you know, you obviously need more liquid before going on a plane. And managed to persuade Cathay Pacific to make the sort of Noodle soup bar the focus of their lounge. And they were very nervous about it at first, because for them, it wasn't maybe a luxury thing. They knew that people loved it, but, you know, written down, it didn't sound any great shakes. But we said that, you know, that was our challenge as designers, was to make it great, you know, to make it into that thing, to materialize that idea. And it's worked incredibly well. I mean, people have, you know, very nice friendships with the people working. There's the people going in every day. They know each other by name. You know, it's a completely different experience. And I mean, you know, food waste is slim to none. Nobody goes and asks for 10 noodle soups, and much healthier. Last but not least, sleep. I mean, one of the first things in our brief from the board was, you know, no sofas because people sleep on them. And, you know, it's kind of true at the beginning of an airport lounge, or indeed in an airport. You know, people tend to be lying across the sofas with their bags all around them. And it's not the greatest look, it's true. But, you know, come on, they're knackered. You know, be human, for heaven's sake, you know, figure it out. So after much discussion, we were able to agree that a space at the very end of the lounge could actually be turned into a really large sort of nap room, which again is, you know, super popular. But it's like, come on. And it's also not just for customers. I mean, imagine if you work there endlessly having to drag grumpy passengers off the sofas. I mean, you know, that's also a hideous gig. So it's really trying to think how to make, through sometimes very normal, commonsensical steps, daily human experience into a better thing. And I think that that process, that approach, is independent of budget and independent of sector. It's an approach, although sometimes it's true, you have to fight quite hard for it. Normally, our main focus is interiors, but just one product to show is a project we did with Nanny Machina. And again, I mean, there we didn't think about what's it going to look like. Actually, what we wanted to do was look right back at the root of, in this case, textiles, and what would make the least possible impact on the environment and be the best for the people making it. What could we do as designers that at the root would change the experience in terms of the makers, but also in terms of the impact on the planet. And the producers said that it will be no bleach, no dye, locally sourced in the sense of nearest possible access to materials, and hand spun, because that actually provided jobs in their locality. And it was just really interesting. I mean, we used chobi wool from Afghanistan, which was woven just over the border in Pakistan, nettle, jute, I mean, you know, all organic materials, all made local as possible, because obviously the producer's not always in the same place where the material comes, but, you know, as close as possible. But of course, if you take that approach, you have to let go of the idea that you send over a design and just get it made as if invisibly by, you know, a machine. It's really a participation, it's a collaboration with the makers. And the outcome was really interesting. I mean, we had a two-way exchange of, you know, seeing what they could make with those criteria, and very strictly controlled criteria, but what could be changed in terms of detail to just make it feel special. But what's particularly interesting about this project, because it was with Nanny Machina, who's super well established, trustworthy, responsible, wonderful woman and company, is that it's actually available for contract. You know, it's not the cheapest, but nor is it, you know, it's not a sort of bubble. It's actually a realistically priced product for the contract market. And it proves it can be done if you think about it systemically rather than always in terms of a product.
Are we talking about the rug, Ilse? Is that the
No, the
product?
whole thing, everything. I mean, not the chair, but the textiles. So the rugs, the cushion, all the textiles. So there's a cotton hammock. This is the chobby wool rug you're looking at here. There's nettle and jute. There's 7 products basically within the range. But I think what was interesting about that collection was that it was really a system more than it was focused on, make it like this. The system, given those strict criteria, then became a different way of working where we could produce something really beautiful, but we had to let go of that initial control. The control was in the criteria, not in imposing a specific design. That's it.
Okay, cool. Can you unshare your screen, please?
There we are.
So did you start the airport lounge noodle bar trend then, Ilse?
Maybe, but not by thinking it's an airport lounge noodle bar trend. We basically came to it by talking to people who said that, they wanted to arrive ideally feeling slightly healthier, when they got there than when they left, or at least not wretched. And, also the very obvious thing that you can, create lovely spaces, but if they smell of sort of old baked beans under a heat lamp, that's also not helpful. And the food waste thing, which was just shocking, really shocking. Not to mention the fact that I understood that there were so many people working behind a wall producing this food that everybody threw away. I mean, it was just a bizarre setup. But, it's a legacy from the 20th century when more was, what everybody thought they wanted. But I think, to the point that you were making earlier with Peter, I think, it isn't anymore. I think we're looking at quality, we're looking at ethics, we're looking at how things are made and where they go. And I think as designers, we have to square the circle. Not on our own, we're working with people, but, we have to stand for that. We have agency.
I wish British Airways would give you a call, because I'm sure you've been in their lounges at Heathrow where you go there at 10 to 9 and there's piles of croissants and bacon and breakfasty stuff. And then at certain points, the staff turn up with trolleys with the lunch stuff and they take all the breakfast stuff.
I mean, yeah, the airport lounge is a weird thing. And, I must say, initially, when we were asked to look at it, I thought, what? Who would ever want to go to an airport lounge? But then I thought, actually, that is quite a good challenge. Why would you want to go? And then I understood, actually, that for a lot of people who have to travel a lot for work, they actually are, they're kind of co-working spaces, really,
When did you do the first Cathay Pacific lounge?
Golly, I think it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and the rest since then.
So you're associated with the kind of notion of well-being in interiors. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What does that mean, and how do you achieve that?
Well, I look at it as the idea of our well-being being something that is intrinsically interconnected with our neighbours. I mean, I think that it's about, you can't be well on your own. Let's face it, we are social animals. We are connected to each other. We're connected to a bigger picture. We are the system ultimately. And I think that true well-being is something that is about how we can join the dots in that respect. So yes, it's looking at it from a point of view of the individual, but yes, taking that through obviously issues like health, community, sustainability, even economics. I mean, it's all connected. I think the fact that it's all been looked at in silos is a relatively recent phenomenon and doesn't make sense.
And when we're talking about design in times of change, obviously we're in a time of incredible change at the moment. We don't really know what the world's going to look like after this, or even if there is going to be an after this. I mean, maybe
Well,
this,
completely.
I mean,
Absolutely. Will it just continue for, I mean, it's, everybody talks about the vaccine, but, there isn't a vaccine for HIV. I mean, I think hopefully, but let's not make that assumption.
but as a designer, is there anything that you can foresee that would be needed in interiors or in design to help us get out of this, or when we return to some kind of semblance of normality? How will the pandemic change interior space, for example, in terms of...
Well, I know there's been a lot of discussion around that, and I think that, there's also a lot more research that's got to come through, because it's changing in front of our eyes, really, even as we, week by week. I mean, I noticed a couple of weeks ago, the Center for Controlling Diseases, the CDC, issued something that basically said that actually surfaces are not much of a problem. I mean, it's not that you want to go around licking the tables, but that the virus is extremely unlikely to be transferred through surfaces unless you touch them, and you're very unlucky to touch something that's had a massive viral overload, and then you sort of rub your eyes. I mean, wash your hands, do not touch your face, would seem to be the more important part of that. I mean, having said that, obviously we need to be more conscious of cleanliness, but if you look at the facts as I understand them, ventilation is a much more important issue. In fact, airborne molecules from talking in close proximity hover in the air for sort of 18 minutes. I mean, that is really problematic. So I think thinking about ventilation, thinking about physical distancing, I think is probably, if you look at a hierarchy in terms of interior design, super important as compared to rushing around turning everything into sort of wiped down plastic. Having said that, what I think is interesting is the practices of cleanliness are really important. And I think we are going to be very, very demanding of, the optics of places that are kept clean, and trusting the trustability of the establishments we use.
There's also the kind of the performance and ritualistic side of hygiene. I mean, a lot of design, a lot of interior design, spas, hospitality over the last decade or so has been so focused on the ambience of a space, water, scents, sound. But I came into our office building on Monday for the first time in 2 months to be confronted with a 5-litre plastic pump.
Absolutely. No, the optics of cleanliness.
Squirts alcohol onto your hand at such a velocity that it splashes all over you. It's like, that's okay, that's hygienic, but it's not much of an experience.
No, and I think absolutely we have to figure out what the really important things are and then integrate them into buildings going forward. I mean, just quite pragmatic things like, in hotel rooms, I think, we absolutely have to have a place where you can have either your hand sanitizer or ideally a sink as you go in, place where you can take your shoes off before you enter the bedroom, etc. I mean, it's really thinking about physical space quite differently, but actually, funnily enough, it's almost going back a century, isn't it? Because when you look at, the way that cities changed sort of late 19th century, early 20th century in reaction to, cholera, typhoid, the influenza, it's, you can see big similarities. I mean, the so-called Bermondsey Revolution radically reduced child mortality, for example, from cholera, and also numbers of women dying in childbirth through a whole series of social actions, but also sort of health actions. I mean, in a matter of a few years, it feels like that kind of social rupture is something we're confronting now. So it's I think it's going to be a big, I think, social change, big mindset change. And I think we will see it in design in quite radical ways.
And again, to go back to my experience of coming back to the Dezeen office, I'm not sure, have you been to our office in Hoxton, Ilse?
No.
I mean, I used to think it was quite a cool office. It's, you know, Pernilla Ostedt designed it. It looks great. But what I've realized is it's so unhealthy because we have a whole wall of glass overlooking the canal. It's north facing, so you don't tend to have the sun blasting in, which looks very, very pretty. But of course, the problem with that kind of concrete glass walled space is you have to have air handling on all the time to keep it cool.
Yeah.
Now, you know, obviously, but you can't open the windows more than.
No, and natural ventilation is, you know, one of the most significant things. I mean, funny enough, I work and live in a, you know, late 19th century building, which was formerly a tannery. And of course, they had to have cross ventilation. So actually, my building is probably healthier than yours.
Yeah, so I'm sitting here on my own thinking, if we want to bring people back to the office, which at the moment we're not going to, and nobody wants to come back, I've been come here, we would have to have a word with the landlord about making the windows more openable, because we don't want to put the air conditioning on.
Yeah, no.
Fans blowing the same air around, that causes the same problem. But you know, the other thing I was thinking is there's been because everyone's at home at the moment in London, so burglaries are down, but instead people are stealing bicycles like crazy.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I gather.
So we were talking this morning.
Trying to get a deal on a bicycle.
Yeah, or to have a bike park in the office, because we always used to ban people from bringing their bikes into the office because they do take up so much space, and they look like something from the street rather than something from the workplace. But we might have to reconfigure things so that we allow people to bring their bikes in.
But it is interesting. And I mean, even things like thinking about how when you're organizing seating, people should sit back to back rather than front to front, although obviously, you know, there's limits to that. But, you know, your whole way of looking at how you would organize clusters of people in a space is going to be completely different. I think it's going to require a whole different approach. But having said that, I mean, as you say, I mean, right now, not many people want to come back to work, but even in the categories where supposedly people will still come back and work together, apparently estimates are now running at about 20%. So, you know, that's a very different workplace. You know, basically we've been fast tracked into the future. You know, it was probably going to happen anyway, but now it's happened for real, and we've got to figure it out quickly.
Because your home is also your workspace, isn't it? Your office is in the same.
Yeah, I mean, I live above the shop. Yeah.
And what's happening with your team then? Are they all going to continue working from home, or have you figured out how you're going to do that yet? We're
in the process of doing it. I think, you know, not everybody can work from home. That's the reality. I mean, it's very nice, obviously, you know, we've had a lot of discussions around that. You know, for some, working from home is great. But for others, if they're in small shared flats, you know, if they've got bad internet, if they don't necessarily even like their flatmates, you know, there are many, many reasons why people might actually want to go to work. But the interesting thing is, and I've heard this from people who are sort of in the office business, they say that actually people don't want to come back, funnily enough, to work, or at least not in the sense of concentration and productivity. They want to come back to be with other people.
And sorry, there's somebody at the door, which is very weird. I'm here in the building all on my own, but because it's so quiet, you hear different noises that you don't normally hear. Another thing I was thinking of, that because we're being constantly told that outside is safer, that you can be, you know, well, when you showed your picture of that interior in your first project, I think everyone's now programmed to look at lots of people together and think, why aren't they social distancing?
I know, completely, exactly.
Even movies from years ago, you think, I can't believe that they're actually touching in the street. But maybe there's a potential for a new hybrid indoor-outdoor kind of space, because of course, you couldn't do a meeting outside if it was raining, but it wouldn't be too complicated to think of a way of putting some kind of awning over it so that it was good through ventilation. So we could potentially see a rise of a sort of hybrid indoor-outdoor space, maybe.
Yeah, and I think also, hours. I think, people will be able to probably go into work. I mean, I don't know, not 24/7, but, choose their hours. Other ways to be able to create more space. But absolutely, I think we're going to have to be extremely creative in how we can basically allow the possibility of distance in what is, normally speaking, quite a squashed up city.
Tell us a little bit about your background, Ilse. It's quite an interesting story how you came from journalism into design.
I mean, I think I am a hybrid or a mongrel, depending which way you look at it. Because my dad was a journalist and economist, and my mum was an artist, and I used to be caught between the two. So I think I do have the capability of switching on one bit and turning off the other. And initially, I was very keen to be an architect, actually. That was definitely what I wanted to be. But for various reasons, I ended up as a journalist. And that's how we initially got to know each other, when I was editing a magazine. And I found that fascinating because while I think, magazines literally have a shelf life, I mean, they're really enjoyable for a while, but have a limited fascination span. They do teach you certain skill sets, not least being able to interrogate a topic, look at the bigger picture, and make sense of it so that you can communicate it to a bigger audience. And oddly enough, some designers have those skills, but not many. They get so focused on the design that I think that contextual way of looking at design certainly was, I mean, less so today, but a really useful tool I found when I actually finally did move into having my own studio. So that combination is still very much at the root of our practice. So we have journalists, we have strategists, but we also have interior designers, architects, and product designers who work together. But it is so funny, one of the most powerful tools we find when we're talking to clients, once we've sort of, created the notion of what something could be, is a film, because that makes people start to understand what something could be. Because up to that point, I think it's really hard for most clients, I mean, especially in the commercial sector, where typically a client will be a money guy or a numbers guy rather than a creative. Until something's real, it's really, really hard for many people to imagine it. So building that trust, really, I think, is such an important part of our role as designers if we want to build new realities. Otherwise, we're going to be condemned to just repeating what's already there.
You said in your presentation, I think it was when you were talking about noodle bars, that you had the idea of the noodle bar, but it didn't look very good written down. So how did you?
No, not at all.
You mean literally a paragraph in a proposal? It didn't look very good written down, and how did you then?
Yes, I mean that as well. I mean, they actually did have one tiny little noodle bar in a corner, sort of like a little window in a wall somewhere. And I think the designer in you looks at that and goes, "That could be so amazing." And then you say that to the man in the suit, and they go, "Sorry." Yeah, I mean that's what is so great about the profession, isn't it? Because you can imagine the future. You can see how things could be better. But the tricky bit is how you get there. The implementation of that and the getting people to support that is the really tough bit. I mean, my title, nice to have, but not need to have, is a real thing that was said after 3 years of work on a project where we were being value engineered again. And the project manager just looked at us and said, "Well, I mean, the interior design, it's nice to have, but not need to have, is it?" And, yeah, that is always, until something is real, I think, unfortunately, design is often seen as the kind of soft stuff. I mean, I would argue that the soft values are absolutely the things that we need the most in a hard world. But also, it's not that we are. I think it's simply that we are intangible until we're tangible.
Sorry to keep going on about noodle bars, but
what is it about noodle bars?
Do you know what? I've said this to a few people now. It's like, when you're in a situation where you can't have what you would normally have, I think I'm quite flexible, but there's always one thing that I obsess about. And ever since this lockdown started, it's ramen. I'm just desperate to have some ramen. But what is the commercial logic that makes airlines or hotels put on these kind of massive buffets when then they throw it all away again after a few hours? I mean, I've never understood that about hotels. Like in a way, you're especially with children, the size of the breakfast buffet is one of the key things that they remember when you go to a hotel. But at the same time, it's crazy because who wants more than 3 different things? You don't need 50 things.
I mean, I think it's an old school idea of plenty. It's almost like Henry VIII's banquet or something. Somewhere lodged in the back of people's brains is the idea that must be luxury. But it's obviously wrong on so many levels. I mean, the food waste, number 1, 2, 3, and 4. But then also for the individuals, I mean, people unfortunately do very often have eyes bigger than their stomachs, and they eat too much. I mean, that's proven that they eat massively more when they serve themselves from a buffet. It's none of it good, and especially not if you're about to get on a plane. So I do not understand, to be perfectly honest, but I think sometimes you really need to spell it out. And actually, once we've gone through that whole process of saying why it made no sense, they were still nervous, but I had enough passengers that I'd spoken to who vouched for the fact that they would really much rather have a fantastically personally made ramen soup and feel much better at the other end. And, that helped. And also, you only need to look at the people who fly today. I mean, maybe once upon a time, there was perhaps, especially in a business lounge, I guess, the kind of slightly portly gentleman. But today, they're sort of, skinny, they're runners, they're women, there's all sorts of, people that basically are much more concerned about their health, I think, than, historically might have been the case.
Also, at the British Airways Lounge at Heathrow, it's one of my least favourite places, although it's one of the spaces.
Yeah, I'm not fond either, I have to admit.
All the water is in glass bottles. So if you want a glass of water, you have to go up. I mean, this is even before the pandemic. You have to touch a bottle, you have to open it, and then 3 glasses of water, and then that bottle's empty. I don't mind using water from a tap.
Exactly. And also, what's wrong with just having a really great tap? I mean, what's the problem with that? I think in the case of BA, I'm afraid, I think it's all rooted into a kind of, slightly kind of, are you being served department store snobbery. It's a very strange experience, I think, the whole process of BA. And certainly as a woman flying, I've given up counting the number of times they look straight through me and look at the man in front of me or behind me for guidance. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Oh, I think we stumbled upon something here. Well, anyway.
You and your noodles.
I'm not going to be in need of an airport lounge for a while anyway, so it's all academic. Ilse, it's been great speaking to you, as always. Say hello to Oscar, and hope we get to see each other properly in the real world before too long. And good luck with your Braun masterclass.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Marcus. Nice to talk to you.